Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of the YouTube show and podcast, None of Our Businesses, where we talk about accounting, taxes, business, finance, all of the above, or maybe none of the above, maybe something totally unrelated, but we always do it from the perspective of accountants. I'm Ty Carr, and with me today is Charlie Zygmunt.
Hi, everybody.
And Tammy Hess.
Hi, everyone.
And here's what we've got on deck for today. An article from a firm that we know and have worked with before, Harris Bricken. They write on why the banking definition of a marijuana-related business ultimately seems to cover just about everyone. Then we get into a book author who raised funds for self-published work through Kickstarter. You'll be amazed how quickly and how much funds were raised. Accounting firms' revolving door with the Treasury Department. Is this really a problem, or is it perhaps a good thing? And the Sackler family woes. What do we think about it? Finally, gaps in resumes. Is that still a question? All right, well, let's kick it off. We'll start it off today with Charlie.
So I've got an article we can talk about today from Harris Bricken Silwaski LLP. So it's a law firm, of course. And basically the article is called Cannabis Banking. All businesses are marijuana-related businesses. Now that's a clickbait title right there, meant to get you upset. So let's dive in a little bit and see why. Basically, over 8 years ago, the FinCEN, which is a government body for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, published this memo called the FinCEN Memo of February 14, 2014. And basically what it did is it laid some groundwork for defining what a marijuana-related business was, and then individual early adopters like credit unions and small businesses developed a secondary scheme on top of that to try to classify and work with these different marijuana-related businesses. And so what they basically said in that is that there's 3 tiers. You either are a business that touches the plant, and that's a tier 1. You're a business who derives most of its revenue from marijuana-related activities, and that's a tier 2. And then what the article is all about is tier 3, which is supposed to be anybody who services a marijuana-related businesses. And so what the author's point is he's saying, well, if you expand how you look at what it means to service a marijuana-related business, then a bunch of other things come into play there. So for example, like a restaurant who has marijuana employees that eat there would potentially be servicing a marijuana-related business according to that. And so he also talks about how individual investors are tied up in this as well, because they invest in things like mutual funds that sometimes have money in marijuana-related real estate investment trusts. And he also talks about how oftentimes one bigger company will have related entities or arms of its company that then turn around and invest in marijuana-related businesses. And so it takes all of these things and it says, well, if you really believe that, then everybody is a marijuana-related business. And so it seemed reasonable at first as I was reading it, because in some way I do think we're all, impacted by it indirectly or not. But the only thing that caused me kind of to stop and think about it a little more is that I know that 280E, the legislation designed to basically govern how these marijuana businesses operate and what they're allowed to deduct and whatnot, it disallows a lot of these costs. And it basically turns things that they would otherwise pay as a business functionally into draw for the business. Like the owner just took the money and spent it on something else. And so if you look at it that way, if a marijuana business were to withdraw money and then turn around and go to a restaurant as the owner and pay his meal, I think it would be a little bit of a stretch to say that that business is now a tier 3 or a tier 1 marijuana related business. And so I want to get your guys' take on really, what does it mean to be servicing a tier 1 business? Do you think that the non-deductibility of certain costs makes it so that this lawyer's point doesn't apply as broadly as he's trying to make it? Or what do you guys think?
Yeah, I don't know if the deductibility ultimately should play into the analysis. I think other than I think kind of what you were getting at is that the deductibility or lack of deductibility could motivate the marijuana businesses, the cannabis businesses' behavior. But yeah, I don't, I think that's right. I think that I don't think it's actually the case if you did like real stringent tracing that marijuana business dollars end up in every other business. But I think the truth is in between, right? Like it's like, well, there's a lot more exposure, a lot more other businesses end up with dollars coming from cannabis enterprise than we think. Way more than we think, right? So is it that every business? Well, probably, whenever you use a word like every, that's an extreme, and I'm sure there's a counter case out there that can be brought up to prove that it's not literally every business. But I think if the point is that the dollars generated by cannabis business ultimately find their way into the revenue streams of a lot of other businesses, maybe even most other businesses in some fashion, that I think that is somewhat believable to me.
Yeah, I guess when I was thinking this through, I'm trying to figure out what the point is, or what the author is trying to get us to really focus on, and what business activity would that change too. So I wasn't sure what your thoughts are on that, Charlie.
So his whole take is that he would like there to be a sweeping rewrite of the legislation that governs how banking deals with marijuana businesses. And he thinks that the current setup is not really usable if you take it the way it's written. And so for him, the goal is rewrite banking laws so that marijuana businesses can operate reasonably. And yeah, I think that's his angle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think on that point that the distinction between a business that is related to cannabis or not related, because of the way it's written and because of the points that he's making, that distinction is somewhat obscure. It makes it kind of arbitrary. When banks are applying the rules and they decide that some businesses can bank with them and some businesses can't because they're too close to cannabis, these rules are obscure enough or confusing enough that banks are making these choices in a somewhat arbitrary fashion, which I would say anecdotal experience, our anecdotal experiences, that's definitely true. That there's the clear-cut cases of companies that are actually handling and trafficking in cannabis, and then you've got all the ancillary businesses. And in some cases, we hear of ancillary businesses that have no trouble getting banking, even though their primary customers are cannabis companies. And in other cases, the bank simply going on a website to see that the ancillary business serves cannabis companies causes them to not be able to get banking. So I think that's that. I think that point that these rules, if read the way this writer is kind of describing them, could mean that a vast majority of any kind of business out there could be disallowed from banking if you follow these rules to the extreme, is left banks kind of just arbitrarily applying the rules, and they're not really. And so I think so just to bring it back to what you said, Charlie, let's rewrite the rules, right? Let's make this more clear, and I think the ultimate goal obviously is to get rid of the banking restrictions for companies that are operating legally within the states, right? That is the holy grail of what everyone actually wants here.
And I think that's the main point, because that's kind of what I was leaning towards. If we fix that problem, then all this other kind of tracking and all the issues that kind of can play wouldn't be in play. So it would be interesting to see, or if we can see where the traditional banks will ever accept that or change that view.
Well, hopefully with articles like this, we'll start to, move the needle, and we'll get to see actual change in this industry coming up in the near future. We'll see how it plays out. And of course, we'll be here to let you know as we go along that journey. Do you have another article we can talk about, Tammy?
I do. I found an article from CNBC regarding how an author raised funds to publish his novels. Brandon Sanderson launched a Kickstarter campaign seeking $1 million to self-publish novels that he wrote during the pandemic. He reached that goal in 35 minutes. And after 2 days, he actually funded or obtained $19 million in pledges. I just took a look and it's up to almost $22 million with 27 days to go. So from looking at his campaign, he has over 92,000 backers. And with my quick math, that averaged to be about $240 per backer. This has become the most funded Kickstarter campaign for a publishing project. And according to this article, many artists have used Kickstarter to fund various projects and assess customer demand. And in this case, it appears that it's been extremely successful for Sanderson. For those that are not as familiar with Kickstarter, the basic premise is that a creator sets their funding goal and deadline, and those that want to support the project, called backers, will pledge money to make it happen. If the project is successful in reaching its goal by the established deadline, the backer's credit card will get charged and the project can launch. If it doesn't reach the goal, no one's charged, and presumably the project is not started. I did some further digging, and according to Kickstarter's website, almost 40% of campaigns are successful. Most raise less than $10,000, but that statistic is growing. And so I personally am not as familiar with Kickstarter. However, reading this article and seeing the success that Sanderson had, it did leave me wondering if there's any really downsides in this type of funding or using Kickstarter to launch a campaign and or a project.
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking about it, and I think that, I think that Kickstarter is a good answer for businesses that are in a very specific range. I think when you've got an idea that's so great that it's going to fund $1 million in 35 minutes, I think that that's an idea that probably should have not been on Kickstarter. Obviously, it was successful, so it's like clearly it seems like it should be. But I think that when something's that successful, you would then want to look for whatever is going to basically give you the best economy of scale for that idea. And I think the Kickstarter's fees would make it prohibitive compared to what traditional printing press cost might be. I think what's tricky about that is you don't know until you start it. He probably didn't. It said in the article that he had made the post and then he went to bed thinking nothing was going to happen. He came back up and everybody had already done it. And so I think that's really the trickiness of it. But yeah, I think the fees are what makes it not a good fit for every business. That's my take. What do you think, Ty?
Well, I think you can't discount, that Brandon Sanderson is a well-known fantasy novelist. So, and he's had New York Times bestsellers and hits and stuff. And so I don't think that on the other side of that point, he didn't know how much success he would get with it. I don't think the average business can expect that level of success because they don't have that kind of fame and notoriety going into it, and that kind of audience just waiting for their kind of next work kind of thing. So I think it is cool to see. I am a Brandon Sanderson fan as well, and so I thought it was cool to see that he actually has that many fans. I didn't really having read some of his work and enjoyed it. I didn't have a perspective on that his popularity would be at that level. But so yeah, that's my thought. Not everybody's going to get that kind of reaction. He's got a head start.
Yeah, that he does, and I think that it's continuing to climb and to show that. I was checking out the campaign website over this today, and it kept on. I mean, by the day it was growing. I think when I first checked it in the morning, it had grown by $1 million by the last time I checked it. So it's fascinating. I do think that he did have quite a head start. So one who may start utilizing Kickstarter may not assume that they're going to have that same level of success, but it's also, it's always good to dream and see what happens. And it's a good way to see if you do have, that many fans. Because to your point, Ty, if you didn't realize that he was that famous or that well-known, and to see that his ideas and what his interest is in his next 4 novels that he wrote over the last couple of years, I mean, it's showing that he does have that consumer drive. So it's good to see. All right. Well, I think you have your next or the next article, Ty.
Yeah, the article I did was a kind of a it came from Thomson Reuters. I don't know if we'll be able to link that, but I can describe it pretty succinctly here, and that is that they were reporting on criticism that came from Senator Warren and Representative Jayapal against the way there's a revolving door between the Department of Treasury and the big accounting firms. And the issue that the way they describe the issue is that people will leave big accounting firms, they'll join the Department of Treasury. They specifically were talking about lawyers doing this. They would join the Department of Treasury. They would help in the Department of Treasury in their roles. They would work on policy, and the Department of Treasury writes regulations for the Internal Revenue Code, and so policy, IRS policy and regulations on how the federal government will interpret the Internal Revenue Code. They work on those issues, and then they later return. They leave their roles in public service at the Department of Treasury, and they go back into working for the big accounting firm, and that there is an observation that upon returning, they have promotions, like they return and they are promoted to a higher level perhaps than they were when they left. They're given bigger salaries, and it seems to be that there could be a quid pro quo, in the sense of when these folks are working in the accounting firms, they're working with large multinational companies or that have certain interests in how tax law is interpreted and administrated, and then they go work in government and they can affect those things, and then they come back out of government and they get cushy jobs with raises. And Senator Warren and Representative Jayapal are calling foul on that. They're saying there's something suspicious about that cycle that we can observe happening. This has been going on for a very long time. And I guess I would point out that while I would not put it past the idea that someone who went through that process could have behaved unethically, I would say that I think what they're missing in their criticism is that if somebody is working in the Department of Treasury at a pretty high level and they're helping form policy, well, I think they're missing two things. Number one is, let me back up for a second. The talent pool for people who have a in-depth understanding of federal tax law and tax administration and the history of the law, the congressional intent in passing the laws, how the laws interact with each other, because we've got our Internal Revenue Code in this country is very complicated. It's a spaghetti mess of things where one rule can interact with another rule and cause a lot of issues. The talent of people who really understand that in depth across a wide variety of the laws and the industries that it affects is pretty small. And so, if you look at this on the front end, if you say, well, if you basically said, well, we don't like this scenario, and you could strike it down on both ends, right? If you strike it down on the front end and you say, hey, the Treasury should not be taking on people from big five accounting firms, they shouldn't be bringing them into their ranks because of the possibility of this. Well, the talent pool of who really has the knowledge base and experience to work on these issues is already small. And now if you wipe out the people who are working in large accounting firms who have this knowledge and experience, I mean, it's just not practical. These are the people who have experience with the law. They are people who have a lot of knowledge and technical knowledge of thinking through the issues involved in the law and how it affects various taxpayers in various situations. And there's not a lot of them. And so shrinking that, you would really be wiping out an intellectual talent pool that I would argue is actually needed at the Department of Treasury and the IRS. And it would not be wise to cut our civil service off from that talent pool that is available in the public sector. So that's one part of the problem. The flip side of the problem is assuming that because when people leave the Department of Treasury, working on high-level issues, helping form policy, really kind of having a good in-depth understanding of why laws and interpretations were set, because they were there, they were on the front lines helping advise on that and form it. And then if they go work for an accounting firm and they get a big salary, assuming that that big salary is a payoff because they did something unethical while they were at the government, is just wrong, in the sense that, like I said, is it possible that somebody in that cycle did something unethical? Yes, but to assume that that's the only reason those people are getting a big salary is ridiculous, because you're missing the fact that that experience in the government on the front lines is very valuable. It's very valuable experience. And of course, the firms are going to pay highly for it. So, even if we assume the other thing, that people are acting with the utmost ethics, and that they are, and that they aren't skewing policy in favor of their favorite multinational company while they're in government, then we would still expect them to be getting a really high compensation or remuneration for their experience and knowledge that comes out of their work on those issues while they were in government. And yeah, I mean, and it's kind of beside the point, because perhaps Senator Warren and Senator Jayapal would rail against this as well, but it is, I guess I take offense at Congress members going after accountants who leave government and then get good assignments and good pay in the private industry, because presidents and Congress members get all kinds of financial remuneration for speaking engagements and consulting gigs and things that they take on in the private industry after their turn in government service. So, to go after the accountants who may be getting some of that recognition, I'd say, hey, don't go after our fellow accountants on that. Go after, or our fellow tax professionals, on that. And again, my main point is that while yes, it's possible that this process creates something unethical, I don't think it's inherent to assume that. I think just assuming that this whole thing is all because they're being unethical, that the only reason they're getting paid those amounts when they leave government is because they're doing something unethical, is an inappropriate assumption to just make. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I couldn't agree with you more, Todd, because I think that, you never should assume. And I think there's a common, phrase about what you do when you assume. But, I think that at the end of the day, what I would encourage really the focus to be is, if you feel like someone has been doing something that's unethical, or that had violated some type of law or regulation, or did something that was not right, target that, focus on that, but don't assume that all professionals are going to be doing that. And just because they got paid more for their, hard work and experience that they got while they're at the Treasury, that shouldn't be the focus for that. And, that a lot of times you are rewarded in terms of your experience and the hard work that you do at a different organization for the time that you're there. And if you've gained more skill set, more knowledge, and especially with the tax law, like you said, that skill set and knowledge is already on a very small kind of playing field. And so if you are now the person who has been in, the big firms, and you've been in the Treasury Department, that you really have accelerated your playing card portfolio. So you would be rewarded for that, and, and not in a bad, unethical way. So I would say that target the ones that you really do feel like that they did something, and punish, and hold them accountable accordingly, is kind of my 2 cents on that. And what were you going to say, Charlie?
I agree with you both. I think you've got it right. Another way that I was looking at it was there's this saying correlation is not equal to causation. And so I think this is a really good example of that, because if we step away from accountants for just a second and we just say, what is the likelihood that someone who voluntarily leaves any job and then voluntarily comes back to said job or some other job within the same company? My question is, is it true that most of those people end up getting a raise? Because most people who are leaving and coming back end up, they wouldn't come back if it weren't for that. So when you just look at that fact, I think that's already an example of this whole correlation is not equal causation. And the other thing is that if ultimately we're afraid that they're going to go off to the IRS, implement a bunch of laws, and then get money they didn't deserve as a result of that, I'm not sure honing in on their salary is really the only way to identify that. I mean, realistically, they could just not work back at that same firm and just get a gift from the people and ultimately have accomplished the same end, gotten the same compensation, and they just didn't have a job. And so ultimately, I don't think that them getting these cushy salaries is as much of a smoking gun as the article kind of tries to make it out to be. I do think these things do happen, so I'm not naive to think that somebody is potentially influencing legislation through there. But I just think that, it's not enough to just notice that this phenomenon sometimes happens and then conclude that it must be due to some malfeasance. That's my thoughts. But it's just kind of on a similar topic, I've got another article we can talk about, just about sort of people potentially behaving badly as it could be. In BBC News, there is an article called "Sackler Family to Pay $6 Billion for Role in the U.S. Opioid Crisis." And so I'm sure many people know, but there's a wealthy Sackler family. They're the owners of Purdue Pharma. They're set to pay $6 billion as a punishment for their role in this crisis. Apparently, this is about 1.7 billion more than a previous settlement that they had had judged against them. They did file for bankruptcy in 2019 amid thousands of lawsuits. These are the makers of OxyContin, and they're being blamed for this whole thing, which I think is largely right. But they did plead guilty to criminal charges over it, which they said basically boiled back down to the fact that they sold a painkiller and marketed it while knowing that it was both addictive and being widely abused. And so I thought it was interesting because on the one hand, I look at this and I do think that they are key in this issue. And I do think that they owe something as a result of it. But I'm trying to be careful in terms of just analyzing what's in the article, because if you just take the sentence of knowing that something is addictive and being widely abused, I feel like if that's the bar, then there are a lot of other products that would technically fit those characteristics. Now, clearly, they don't have the same scale, perhaps, as this, because this is a large crisis. But I want to be, I basically want to get your guys' take on how do we assign or think about fault in a case where, yes, they sold something addictive, yes, people were abusing it, but those people had a part in it, and so many other things like alcohol, cigarettes, even weirder things. I was thinking about like over-the-counter medications that people get addicted to or abuse. All sorts of things that people could misuse. And so I just want to get your take on, I guess, why is this different than all of those examples? Because I don't think we see that same outrage, or at least not as much recently, towards those other industries as we do towards this. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think from my understanding or kind of remembrance of this is it's because they did not disclose the fact that it was addictive and that it could cause harm and things of that nature. And if you remember, this is probably before all of our times, but cigarettes did come under fire because it used to be cool to smoke cigarettes, and they would say that there was nothing, they didn't say anything about it being addicted or that it was bad for your health. I think they were kind of silent on that. And then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, many years afterwards, when a lot of pushback came up, they have to disclose on the cigarette cartons or packages, I'm not sure what they're called, but that it has nicotine, which can be harmful, and you're suggested not to smoke. And alcohol is the same way, where if you buy something where it says you shouldn't be drinking it if you're pregnant and things of that nature, it has warnings on those. And I think that the uproar with the opiates is that my understanding is that they did market it saying that it was not. And so they went backwards to be like even more kind of flamboyant about it being like, they knew it was addictive. And then they're saying that, oh, it's not. So you should go ahead and be using it. And then a ton of people got addicted and it became a big, obviously, crisis in that situation. So I think in that sense, when you know something is, and if you don't disclose it at all, or worse, if you say that it's not addictive or it's not, doesn't have any issues, then you should be held accountable, and it should be more of a focal point to do that. Yeah. So that's my only kind of thought on that part, is where it's knowing what, if you're selling a product, regardless, to your point, Charlie, I think there could be other products that are bad for your health or bad, or can lead to other things, but you need to be able to ensure that you are disclosing that, especially if it's going to be something that's severe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it also plays into the discussion that we had at the beginning of the show in terms of I think that our culture has been awakening to and making the comparisons to cannabis and looking at it and saying, well, we've had this war on drugs and we've demonized cannabis for all these years, and yet we've got these otherwise legal companies that are taking, who have profited enormously off peddling substances that have been argued in this vein are way more detrimental for you than, say, cannabis. Now, I don't want to step into that debate and give an opinion on whether I think that's the case or not. I just want to lay that out as that is what's in the discussion. That is what's in the ether here of this discussion, is that on one hand, we have sent a lot of people to jail, a lot of people without a lot of resources and who we have put into jail over dealing cannabis, and we've denied the benefits of cannabis to a lot of people, and yet we have let these profiteers make enormous amounts of money off of these opioids. And so I think that comparison, is really in the background of this discussion in a big way for a lot of people.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I do think it's really hypocritical that they allow certain things to become just part of the mainstream and then other things just aren't. And so, yeah, I think it'd be interesting to, just see how that industry changes. Perhaps we'll have more warnings on those types of things, or perhaps we'll just see less prevalence of manufacturers of those types of products. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it plays out. Do you have another article we could talk about, Tammy?
Yeah, so I have an article. We've been discussing the perceived red flags in resumes before on this podcast, and one being gaps between jobs. However, I found an article from CNN that declares gaps aren't such a big deal anymore. According to the article, a gap in a resume used to give the perception that a candidate would need more time to get up to speed, or that they weren't as serious in getting back into the workforce. With the increased number of job seekers that have gaps in their resume, this perception is beginning to change. In fact, LinkedIn has created a new feature that gives the option of adding a career break to the experience section of a user's profile. This allows them to provide the dates and the reasons for their career gap, and they can even add information as to what they did during that period. The thought is that this would help normalize the fact that there are career breaks and proudly display the breaks in a profile. The article also states that the gaps in one's resume may no longer be a red flag, but resumes with both career gaps and a high number of job changes will still give employer pause. And some of the advice that the article gave was to, when you're discussing a career gap in your resume, focus on the things that you did during that period, such as you obtained new skills, you did some training, or any other relevant experiences that make you a strong candidate for that job that you're applying for. It doesn't give really any advice on job hopping, so I thought we could discuss that here. Because, when I review resumes, I tend not to focus on gaps as much, but I do notice the job hopping. And I tend to ask a lot of questions regarding that aspect. And I was wondering if you guys do the same, and if you have any advice on how to explain a lot of job changes in a resume.
I'm biased. I mean, I've worked for a very long time and I haven't had much gaps. And so when I look at a resume that has a lot of gaps, it generally does cause a little bit of cause for concern. I wouldn't say that it's automatically a bad thing because many people have realistic reasons as to why, and they did things during that time that, as you said, were still relevant and interesting. And so I don't think that it's necessarily a terrible thing, but I do think it's worth understanding what happened to cause that. And I also got a little bit of a kick out of the article because it says, well, if you had a gap and you did a bunch of things that were great during that time, let's mention all of those things. But I feel like that is antithetical to the idea that it is okay to take a break. I think there's two sub points here. It's either you did a bunch of great stuff while you were not working, and that's functionally so close to work that we're gonna think of it like work, and then we're okay with that. Or you took time off and we're okay with that for its own reason. But I don't know. To me, that's the only part that was a little bit of made me roll my eyes a little bit, because it's like, yeah, you could take a break. That's fine. Just tell me all the Nobel Prizes that you won during your break, and then we'll just call that work and we'll be all fine. So that was my only thing. What do you think, Ty?
Yeah, I mean, I think context is everything. I think it depends. I think that with the gaps in a resume, um, really means something different depending on where somebody is in their career, in the life cycle of their career. And unfortunately, that's not, if I when you unpack what I'm saying there, it's not going to sound very fair, or yeah, it's just not going to sound fair to a lot of people. But I mean, it just is what it is, in the sense that, when you're looking at people at the high level, at an executive level, a lot of times the people that you are looking for in those positions, don't literally have to work. And so the context of them, in the sense that the reason why they work goes beyond, at some point, just that they need to make money, right? And it changes the game fundamentally between employer, or organization and employee, because in that context, if somebody said, well, I've been a CEO for a company for many years, and I decided to take a break for a couple of years, and now I want to get back into the game. I mean, that story makes sense overall, and it's like, well, no, it makes sense, and it's plausible that, well, you probably are financially stable enough that it's not like you needed to work. You weren't choosing to be off work for 2 years because you had to, or because nobody would hire you, or because you couldn't find the right thing to do. Being off work for 2 years it doesn't necessarily have an impact on some kind of learning curve that you were on, or depending on the industry, it may or may not detract from the currency of your knowledge base that you need to deploy. So all of those things would be questions, but it's also like, it's very plausible at that level, right? That you could maybe come in and out of the workforce, and it makes some sense, because you're not working for money in the same way that when and this is the part that's not fair about it, right? But it is true that when you're staffing an organization, some people that if you're hiring at a high level, some people that you're hiring, the money isn't necessarily the end all be all of why they're working, right? Of course, you have to pay them market, and you have to pay them a lot of money probably, but it's not, they're in a different position in life, right? Whereas when you're working with people who need to work to survive, right? They need the money to get by, to make ends meet. It's a different equation. And it does, the context of that is different, because if you're looking at somebody's resume who, based on when they left school and, what job they had so far, and then you see a gap, you don't know the truth. Like, they could be independently wealthy, and you wouldn't know that, right? But 9 times out of 10, you can probably guess, or the story that their resume paints is that they're like the rest of us. They're a working person, and so it does make you scratch your head in that context and be like, well, what did you do for a year and why did you take a year off, in a situation where it doesn't appear based on the other things happening in your resume. You don't fit the normal profile of somebody just being independently wealthy and not needing to work. So it puts it in a different light than it does in a situation where it looks like that. So that context can matter. And, you know, one of the things that works against us is that, I think that works against people, you know, is that, as regulation often does, is that in trying to be fair-minded, society has said, well, there's certain things you can't ask people about. And that makes sense in a lot of ways. But it also then creates a black box where, you know, whether we like it or not, it means that people, when they're reading resumes, are making assumptions about the context of what's going on because they can't get the information that would illuminate that, you know, or make it that more clear. You know, so there's the context aspect of it. I think another piece of the context, you know, what I talk about, people may not think from what I'm saying is very fair in how resumes get looked at or how people get looked at or evaluated, but I think it's totally the case, as well as setting aside whether you think the context of looking at, well, what motivates this person? How is it that they can take these times off if they don't fit the normal picture of being otherwise independently wealthy or financially secure? They're more of an, seems like they would have to work like everyone else to make money. There's a different question, which is, a lot of people, particularly early on in their careers, are on a growth curve. They are in a training mode, right? There is an expectation that they learn something from one job and they take that to the next job at a higher level, and that then preps them for another job at a higher level. And so there is an issue with being on that ladder, so to speak, and then just like getting off, right? It's not really the case. You know, the realities of life is that it isn't really the case that there's another ladder beside you that you can just hop off and like remain at the same rung. You know, if you don't keep climbing and you've taken time off, it may put you back a couple of rungs, and because you weren't at a point where you had reached you had gotten beyond climbing that ladder in your career. There is a point where sometimes you do get beyond climbing the ladder, like where you are on the ladder doesn't even matter that much anymore because of the type of job and the level that you're interviewing for, that you're working toward. But for a lot of people, particularly if you're kind of within the first 5 to 10 years out of school, you're often in a professional setting, you're often on some kind of path there. And it raises into question, well, how do we evaluate that path if there's gaps in that resume or if there's time taken off, right? And I think so that's, I would summarize all my ramblings here to say that it is context. Context matters. It's not a one size fits all thing. I would never get a resume with a bunch of gaps in it and automatically throw it out, but it does become a data point that, in context with the other stuff that you see on the resume, could create a picture for me that is a very imperfect picture because of regulation not allowing us to ask some things, means that we're just inferring kind of what might be happening there, right? And
I think you touched a really good point, Ty, because a resume is used to kind of demonstrate your abilities, your skill set, and your experience. And because of the fact that a lot of times you're just putting in from, you know, dates of your employment history, that you're not getting a full sense of the in-betweens, you know, because what the article would lead me to believe that it's kind of suggesting, or what LinkedIn is suggesting by creating this gap period, putting it on their profile resume, is that, you know, people could start adding to their resume to give you a bigger, fuller picture. Because in a lot of cases, you know, and when you said that, you know, it's saying that, yes, a gap's okay, but they want you to describe what you did to it. I think what this is telling us is that most people are more accepting and not going to throw away a resume or throw away a candidate based off of gaps or things that are kind of unusual in their resume. But they are still probably wanting to ask. And if they can't ask, and in a lot of cases you can't, it kind of gives you a sense that you need to be able to demonstrate or show or somehow share with them that kind of what is occurring or something to that effect, or what you did that was successful during those periods, so that you don't get overlooked or that other people aren't making assumptions based off of what they're just seeing that's on your resume. So it is a very interesting kind of situation where I would say the article's right. I don't think it's a red flag anymore. But I think it is still an area that people are going to want to explore or at least understand, because they are going to make assumptions. It's really hard not to in that sense. And so, yeah, it's going to be an interesting kind of thing to incorporate into your resume or into your discussion in terms of being selected a candidate. Because I think a resume typically gets you in the door to be interviewed, but in an interview, you can kind of sell yourself and do a lot of things. But if you can't even get into that interview process, and they're just basing whether or not they want you to come into the door or a Zoom meeting or anything like that, based off of what's printed on your resume, you do have a little bit of a challenge there.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and watching the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. Please tune in again next week for more business updates from not just one accountant, but from 3 accountants' perspectives. And also, please check out our sister podcast, Profitless on Purpose, where they're discussing anything and everything relating to the nonprofit space. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, Ron.